Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. This video is about Chapter 6 from Thomas Nagel's book, What Does It All Mean? The chapter is about free will. We're going to start off by thinking about what free will is, and then move on to thinking about whether humans have free will. So let's start with a very basic example. This is the one that Nagel uses in this chapter. Suppose you're going through a cafeteria line, and when you come to the desserts, you hesitate between a peach and a big wedge of chocolate cake with icing. You take the cake and you eat it. The next day you think to yourself, I wish I hadn't eaten the cake. I could have had a peach instead. So let's focus on that statement. I could have had a peach instead. What does it mean? One thing that it might mean is that if you had chosen the peach, you would have had it. Nagel says that the statement doesn't just mean this. It means that you really could have chosen the peach just then as things actually were. To put the point differently, even if everything else had been exactly the same, up to the point when you in fact chose the cake, you nevertheless could have chosen the peach instead. So the idea here is that nothing up to the point of making a decision determines what your choice will be. Up to the point of decision making, it remains an open possibility that you will choose a peach. So your choice isn't determined in advance by anything at all. There were no processes or forces at work before you made your choice that made that choice inevitable. That's what it seems to mean to have free will. Okay, so we know that some things are determined in advance. If we think about some things that happen, they happen in a way that's deterministic. For example, the behavior of ordinary physical objects like sticks and rocks seems to be determined in advance. We have good reason to believe that determinism isn't true at the level of microphysical particles, at the very small level, so at the level of protons and electrons. But the behavior of large macro-scale objects, like rocks and sticks, seems to be governed by what are called deterministic laws of nature. So physical laws that specify exactly how things are going to play out in the physical universe. All right, now how does this relate to the issue of free will? Well, some philosophers have argued that the circumstances that exist before we act determine our actions and make them inevitable, in much the same way that the circumstances that exist before the rock is thrown determine the trajectory the rock's going to take once it is released. So applying this determinism idea to free will, we could define determinism as follows. The sum total of a person's experiences, desires, and knowledge, her hereditary constitution, the social circumstances, and the nature of the choice facing her, together with other factors that we may not know about, all combine to make a particular action in the circumstances inevitable. This is how Nagel defines determinism. It's important to distinguish determinism in that sense from something else that we might think is meant by the word determinism. So determinism, in the sense we have in mind, it doesn't imply that we can know or predict in advance what someone will do before they do it. Predictability isn't the point. The view is that there are laws of nature, like those that govern the behavior of physical objects. These laws govern everything that happens in the physical world. And the circumstances before an action takes place determine what's going to happen. They rule out all other possibilities. If determinism is true, then it doesn't seem to make sense to say things like, I really should have had a peach instead. Because if you couldn't have chosen a peach instead, then it seems like it doesn't make sense to say you should have chosen a peach instead. So our common practices of saying things like you should or should not do something maybe don't make a whole lot of sense if determinism is true. Kind of related idea here about why determinism matters is with respect to what's called moral responsibility. So moral responsibility is the kind of responsibility that a person has for their actions when they can be appropriately held accountable for their actions. They can be praised for good actions, blamed for bad actions, appropriately rewarded for doing good things, or punished for doing bad things. If determinism is true, that means that our actions are determined in advance of our making them or taking them. So how could we really hold anyone responsible for what they do? If determinism is true, then shouldn't responsibility lie with the past and the laws of nature that govern how physical events unfold over time, rather than with any particular individual person? So, if determinism is true, when people do bad things like steal from one another or kill each other, it might seem more reasonable to regard these actions as akin to natural disasters in the same way that we do if, your sandwich on the table is eaten by a bunch of termites. That's just a natural disaster. It might be a bit of a stretch to call it a disaster, but maybe you were really hungry. Who knows? Similarly, if determinism is true, then in the human case, when humans do bad things, those things are also rightly regarded as a kind of natural disaster. So how can we make sense of punishment for crimes if determinism is true? Well, one option here is to say maybe the criminal doesn't actually deserve to be punished if they're not in any way morally responsible for what they did. But maybe it would be a really bad idea not to punish criminals for their crimes, because then they'll just commit more crimes all over again. So in an effort to deter crimes, maybe it's a good idea to punish wrongdoers even if they don't really deserve it. It's worth appreciating that that's a different reason for justifying punishment of crimes. A reason that's different, that is, from, say, a person deserves to be punished because they freely did this bad thing, and so they're morally responsible for it. That's why they deserve punishment. All right, so maybe determinism is true, in which case there are some interesting implications for moral responsibility, for how we should view crimes and punishment. But maybe determinism is false. If determinism is false, is that enough for free will? Nagel says no. Even if determinism is false, your actions could still be random. They could still be probabilistic, but nevertheless fully explained by things that have happened in the past, along with probabilistic laws of nature. Some philosophers have argued that determinism might even be required for free will. So if the act that you take wasn't determined in advance by your desires, beliefs, personality, then it seems to be something that just happened without any explanation. And that doesn't look like a free action. It's not entirely clear what would be meant by the phrase, I determine my choice, if nothing about me determines it. How can I determine the choice if nothing about me determines it? Right? So there's kind of a dilemma here. Either some facts about me determine my choice, like the fact that I like chocolate cake more than peaches, or it's not any set of facts about me that determines my choice, in which case the choice looks to be a random event. In this way, some philosophers have argued that determinism is required for free will. In order for me to really act freely, it has to be the case that facts about me explain the choices that I make. Rather than what you might ask, well, rather than facts about things that are external to me, rather than internal to me. So if the laws of nature, in combination with past events, explain my choices and actions, then it's facts about something outside of me that are explaining my choices and actions. Whereas if it's my own desires and beliefs and personality and perhaps some other psychological traits about me explain my choices and actions, then perhaps I can be free. But doesn't that require a kind of determinism of my actions and choices by psychological states of mind that I am in? Nagel raises the interesting possibility that maybe this feeling that you could have chosen a peach instead of chocolate cake is a philosophical illusion and couldn't be right, whatever is the case. In order to show what's wrong with the idea that we don't have free will, that it's just an illusion, we would have to A, specify what it means to have free will, and then B, provide a convincing philosophical argument for the claim that we actually do have whatever ability free will ends up being. All right, in connection with what Thomas Nagel is saying about free will in this chapter, I think it's worth considering an argument from philosopher Galen Strawson. He calls it the simple argument against free will, and this is the idea. When we act, we do what we do because of the way we are, but we cannot be ultimately responsible for the way we are, so we're not ultimately free. All right, here's what Strawson has in mind here. Whenever you act, so suppose we're thinking about the example where you decide to take the piece of chocolate cake and then you take it and you eat it. Right? Grabbing the piece of chocolate cake, sitting down and eating it, that's something that you do. It's an action. Now, why do you do that? Well, says Strawson, because of the way that you are. It may be a fact about you that you enjoy chocolate cake much more than you do peaches. So there's a fact about you that's explaining why you're acting in the way that you're acting. We can ask questions like, well, did you freely decide that you would like chocolate cake more than peaches? No, you didn't freely decide that. You don't freely decide your gustatory preferences or your taste preferences. You just find yourself liking some things, not liking other things, and that's that. And yet, if there are facts about you that are explaining why you're doing what you're doing, but you're not responsible for those facts about you, then how can you be responsible for the actions that you take that occur because of the way that you are? Hence, Strawson's thought that we're not ultimately free. All right, this is an interesting argument. How might we think about evaluating it? So take this first premise, when we act, we do what we do because of the way we are. That seems to be relatively uncontroversial. You might try and push back on this argument by saying, well, wait a second here. Maybe I like chocolate cake more than peaches, but nevertheless, couldn't I still decide to choose the peach over the chocolate cake? Maybe I decide that I want to eat healthy today, and so my desire to be healthy matters more than my desire to eat something delicious in my own mind, and that's what explains my choice. We could say that, but notice what that seems to imply is that although I like chocolate cake more than peaches, I have a stronger desire to eat healthy. My desire to eat healthy is stronger than my desire to eat something delicious. And so the strongest desire in this case is just winning out. It is the thing that's explaining why I'm acting in the way that I'm acting if I decide to go for the peach. Right? So it's hard to see how this premise could be false. When we act, we do what we do because of the way we are. What about the second premise of this argument? We cannot be ultimately responsible for the way we are. Maybe that's true, but maybe that premise is too strong in the sense that maybe we can be somewhat responsible for the way we are. You may not have a whole lot of control over how things taste to you, but don't you have some control over the kinds of traits of character that you can cultivate over time? For instance, you might find yourself being an easily irritated person. The fact that you're irritable isn't something that you're ultimately responsible for, but can't you work at it? Can't you work at becoming less irritated by people around you? Maybe you would need to, meditate more, or reflect on the good things that other people do, or reflect on the fact that you yourself are probably irritating to other people every now and then. Right? The same could be said for other traits of character. You can work at becoming a nicer person, a more compassionate person, a more curious person, a more open-minded person. And so if there is a kind of effort that you can exert in order to cultivate virtues, then don't you have some responsibility for the way you are? Maybe it's not ultimate responsibility, but maybe it's enough to warrant claiming that even though we're not ultimately free, we still have a little bit of free will. Right? So that doesn't in any way undermine Strawson's argument, because Strawson's conclusion is just that we're not ultimately free. We don't have any ultimate free will, but maybe we have some. In addition to Strawson's argument, I also find it worthwhile to mention the difference between compatibilism and incompatibilism in connection with Nagel's chapter on free will. Compatibilism is the idea that is taken very seriously in philosophy, that free will and determinism are actually compatible with one another. In other words, even if determinism is true, you still might have free will. It depends on what free will is. Some philosophers find it intuitive that free will is the ability to do whatever it is that you want to do without being forced to do it or not do it by some other person. So if you want to eat the chocolate cake and then you grab the chocolate cake and you sit down and eat it, and no other person forced you to do that or manipulated you into doing that, then you act freely. This is a conception of free will that's consistent with determinism, because even if you want the chocolate cake and your wanting it explains why you grab it and sit down and eat it, it could also be true that you were determined in advance to do that by deterministic laws of nature in combination with everything that's happened in the past up to the point of your choosing the chocolate cake. Right, so that's an interesting idea. Maybe you think initially free will and determinism can't be compatible with one another. Now, this sort of gets to the heart of the free will debate in philosophy. If, in order to be free, in order to have free will, it has to be true that at the point of making a choice, you have live, alternate possibilities available to you, then free will and determinism are not compatible with one another. That's a view called incompatibilism. But if free will does not require live alternate possibilities at the moment of choice, that is, if free will is compatible with the idea that at the moment of making a choice, there really is only one possible option, because the laws of nature, along with all past occurrences, determine what your choice is going to be, then you might have free will even if determinism is true.